The year is 1916, and a 7-year-old boy is walking down the sidewalks of Manhattan with his mother, peering into store windows, checking out the toys, whatever merchandise is in there. And they happen to stop in front of a stamp shop. The boy looks into the display window and sees this. That's the 1905 Barbados issue featuring the olive blossom. The young boy is fascinated with this exotic-looking stamp, and boom, a stamp collector and legend is born. In 1932, in the depths of the Great Depression in America, armed with a new master's degree in journalism from the University of Oregon and a pink slip from the Morning Oregonian newspaper, Harman Herst Jr. set out for New York City with a letter of recommendation to the New York Times. As it happened, he did get a job with the New York Times, but not as a reporter. He was selling classified ads. On his first day, he made a whole $1.50, which wasn't bad, except that, as it turned out, that was his peak earnings day. Several more days of futile attempts at selling classifieds, and he decided, this ain't for me. And armed with another letter of recommendation, he wound up in Newark, New Jersey at the Star-Ledger, where, once again, he was selling classified ads, or rather, not selling classified ads. Within a week, though, he hit pay dirt, landing a job on Wall Street as a bond runner in the bond office of Lebenthal & Company. Now, a bond runner, back in those days when a company or an investor bought bonds, the bond broker handed the bond to a bond runner who would run it down to the office of that investor or company. The job started out at a salary of $12 a week, and within a month, he had increased his wages to $15 a week. One day, he made a bond delivery to the shop of Henry Needham, a stamp dealer. Hearst was shocked to see that Needham was in the process of franking a registered letter with a complete set of the 1901 Pan American set, which had a face value of 30 cents and a retail value of 75 cents at that time. He asked Mr. Needham, what are you doing? What are you doing that for? And Mr. Needham told him, it makes people happy. And then he asked Herman, do you collect stamps? When Hearst answered in the affirmative, Needham said, well, go ahead, take a set. And he still had partial sheets of the Pan Americans he was working off of, and he picked out a nicely centered pair from each sheet and handed Hearst the set with the admonition, always pick the best. When he got back to the bond office and told his bond runner buddies about this, they were all excited and they wanted to make the runs to Needham's office too. So they set up a rotation in which each bond runner in turn would go to Needham. In this DVD from the American Philatelic Society, which shows the Dr. Stanley M. Bierman interview with Herman Herst from 1984, Hearst tells the story of when he got back to the bond office after getting that set. He told his best buddy about it, who immediately wanted to take the next run to Needham's office. And when he did, in fact, get that run, he goes into the office, delivers the bond, and tells Needham, I'm a stamp collector. To which Needham replied, that's nice. And his friend returned to the bond office empty-handed. However, 2 or 3 more times, running a bond to the office, and each time, hint, 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 I'd sure like that set. He eventually got his set of Pan Americans. Now, as you're probably aware, the 1930s in America were like the gold rush days for stamp collectors. Stamp clubs were popping up like mushrooms overnight, as well as stamp publications. One after another just went into business. Anyone who had a printing press started printing a stamp newspaper. And all the city dailies had at least a once-a-week stamp column. In fact, Western Stamp Collector which was the largest circulation stamp publication until Lynn's Stamp News came along a few years later, started out as a small-town weekly newspaper with one column of stamp collecting news each week. As it turned out, their stamp column gained popularity not just in their small town of Mill City, Oregon, but soon statewide, and it even got national recognition and popularity until eventually the newspaper just dropped local news altogether, moved to Albany, Oregon, and became a stamp weekly with 8 to 16 pages a week. Their circulation continued to grow nationally to the point where they even went on a twice-a-week publishing schedule. And for 2 years, Herman Herst wrote a regular feature for the newspaper called Stamp Stories. Back at the bond office of Lebenthal and Company, when they weren't out delivering bonds, all the bond runners were hanging around just talking about stamps all day long. Stamps, stamps, stamps. And it got to the point where Louis Lebenthal, the big boss, said, "No more mention of stamps in this office." So the guys quit talking about stamps. Instead, they started talking about worms. And their little clique became known as the Worm Syndicate. See, on the days that the newspapers ran their stamp columns, all the dealers would hang outside the newspaper offices waiting for that first edition to roll off the press. They'd grab it as soon as it was available, turn to the stamp column, because the stamp column had news on which issues were about to go off sale at the Philatelic agency in Washington, D.C. Then the dealers would all raid the local post offices to buy up the remaining stocks of those issues. As soon as a stamp went off sale, the price on it just doubled from its inscribed face value. And with the tambromania that had afflicted the country at the time, it was no problem to just turn over your stock. You just took your sheets and sold them to another dealer who had already awaiting customers for them. Or at the time, there was also freelance dealers called satcheliers who didn't have shops. They just ran around with briefcases with stamps in them, and they went to dealers, just hustling dealers here and there, and the dealers utilized their services too. So all the members of the Worm Syndicate would chip in $2 a piece, go out and buy sheets of stamps, and then, like I said, it was no problem finding customers to buy them at double face value. Hearst continued to build his stamp business in this way, as well as his own stamp collection, and he soon came to the realization that this is what I want to do in life. After 5 years working in Wall Street, in which time his $12 a week salary had ballooned to $28, he went into the office of Louis Lebenthal to ask for a raise. First words out of his mouth were, "Mr. Lebenthal, I've been here 5 years now," and Lebenthal cut him off with, "Some have been here longer." Well, this let Hearst know in which trajectory this conversation was going. So instead of the raise, he just said, "Mr. Lebenthal, I don't want to work on Wall Street anymore." And with that, he walked out the door, and in March 1936, with a total of $100 of cash capitalization, he rented a $20 office space at 116 Nassau Street, bought an office chair and a roll-top desk, and a glass stamp counter. And Harman Herst Jr., postage stamps for collectors, was in full-time business. Oh, and the olive blossom stamp, that became the logo for his new business. In 1936, Nassau Street was the philatelic center of the universe. And it wasn't the whole street, it was just a portion of the street. And to give you a little perspective, here's a map of Lower Manhattan. And then here's the portion that we're concerned with. The main hub of activity started at the south on Liberty Street, and then went north to where the street ends near New York City Hall. Within that stretch, that only took 5 or 6 minutes to walk total. At its peak, there were 200 dealers. And 116 Nassau Street Stamp Center was right about here. and at its peak, it housed 32 dealers alone. Hearst's office on the ground floor always seemed to be the hub of activity. He was in a pretty good spot where anyone coming in with a collection, he could get them first. The satcheliers always came to see him first, and collectors were always hanging out at his store. Besides his retail business, he also ran mail bid auctions. And with all the excitement in the stamp collecting business at that time, there was other forms of excitement also. There was murder, there was suicide, there were several counterfeiting cases in stamps where Hearst was called on as government witness. It was quite an exciting time to be a stamp dealer then. Hearst spent 10 years altogether on Nassau Street. Like I said, his shop was very popular with collectors, and they would just come out and hang out and just socialize. That was the Twitter sphere of 1930s. In fact, it became so popular with people just hanging out and not buying anything that eventually Hearst had to just close up shop because he couldn't get anything done. And in 1946, he shuttered the Nassau Street shop and moved out to Shrub Oak, New York, and then just continued his retail business through the mail, along with his mail bid sales. In that same year, 1946, he resumed publishing his periodic newsletter called Hearst's Outbursts. He had started publishing these back in the 30s, but just sending them on postcards, as little circulars inside mailings, as part of his text ads in magazines, or published on the back covers of auction catalogs. Now, as he resumed publishing, they were 16-page typeset, text-heavy newsletters mailed out to subscribers for the cost of just 6 self-addressed stamped envelopes. I have a few issues from 1967 and 68 in which he claims a circulation of over 5,000. And he has stated that at its peak, it reached a circulation of 7,000. And one look at an issue will explain its popularity. These are not just simple dealer sales lists with a few random stamp collecting comments thrown in. These are actually mini magazines with full-length articles discussing various aspects of stamp collecting or even politics. And they amply illustrate the author's merit as a degree holder in journalism. This is my little stash of Hearst's Outbursts. The earliest one I have is from summer of 1967. This issue starts with an article on protecting your stamp collection, having proper insurance, because he notes that stamp thefts are occurring with a greater frequency than ever of late. And you'll see it covers the complete next page, and almost another column. So he goes in pretty in-depth with this. Then he talks about a new Gibbons-Whitman catalog. And here again, you see another column. Article on coins, which he doesn't care for. Here's an article about how AT&T telephone company was approached to run the Postal Service as a private organization. There again, you can see how much he goes into it. In the Christmas 1967 issue, he shows his humorous side too. In this piece, headline Minkline Tweezers, I'll read it to you. In this affluent society, some entrepreneur has come up with just about everything that anyone could possibly want, need, or anticipate, even the 5-cent cigar. There is patently little that one can give a philatelist, since stamp accessories are limited in number and not particularly costly to purchase. And for the collector who has everything, there is little to give outside of stamps themselves. For those who wondered what our deep dark secret was, as offered in these columns some issues back, we can now say that it was simply a pair of gold-plated, imported German tweezers, lined with genuine mink. They made quite a hit, and several hundred readers last year became the object of envy when they went to their clubs ready to do business with a device that was the very epitome of luxury. Now for Pat Hearst, and I should explain that. Herman Herst was born on St. Patrick's Day, and for that reason, his friends all gave him the nickname Pat. So, as I was saying, for Pat Hearst, stamp collecting was always about fun. And one way he made it fun was he created his own personalized envelopes. This one is from 1946 when he was still on Nassau Street. And it has a cachet of a 17th century postboy. And as you can see in the caption below, this is number 2 in a series of 6 envelopes showing the history of the carrying of the mails. And you will also notice, too, that he used the word envelopes instead of cover, which just goes to show that he was not pedantic about that type of thing either. This one from 1948, when he was in Shrub Oak, features a cachet that instructs the post office to return the letter back to him if it's undeliverable within 5 days. Now you'll notice, too, that the return address is simply Harman Herst Jr., Shrub Oak, New York. That's because at that time, Shrub Oak had a population of just 642, and it had no home delivery service. So residents had to go pick up their mail at the post office, and all that was necessary was your name and the city and state. And then there's one from 1958 with the cachet of a riverboat, a steamer. As I said, at that time, Shrub Oak did not have local home delivery by the post office. And that's when Hearst discovered a 1862 law that was still on the books, allowing for local post delivery service in the absence of United States home delivery service. And that's when the Shrub Oak local post was born. Now, to be accurate, it was actually 1953, 7 years after he moved to Shrub Oak, that the local post was born. And he had these triangular stamps made up. And the reason they're triangular is because the law stated that any postage stamps created for the local post had to be dissimilar to any U.S. postage stamps. Same goes for the cancellation mark. It could not resemble a circular postmark used by the U.S. Post Office. And so as you see here, this is May 1st, 1953. That is the first day of service. This is a first day cover for the Shrub Oak local post. Here's a postcard from 1957, which I'm not quite sure, but it's kind of obvious, I guess, once you think about it. It's a postcard from a dealer, John W. Millington. But when you look on the address side, it is addressed to John W. Millington Stamp House. So evidently this was a postcard that was sent to Hearst under separate cover, requesting a Shrub Oak local post stamp. And then it was mailed back to him through the mail service. Then here's a postcard, a picture postcard that Hearst had made up, advertising his business. Again, there's the olive blossom and his local post stamp, and it shows him dragging the mail through the snow. Of course, he actually utilized the services of his two young children, his daughter and son. Dear Ben, I appreciate you remembering me and your note. Unfortunately, I have not had very much in your line. It seems to come in bunches and sometimes not at all. If I get anything in oddities of the sort you have gotten from me in the past, you will hear from me. Thanks a lot for writing. Now, as everyone knows, dragons live forever, but not so little boys or little girls. And when the Hearst kids grew up, there went the Shrub Oak local post. But not to fear, local post version 2 appeared. September 23rd, 1966 was the inauguration of Shrub Oak local dog post, featuring Alfie the Wonder Dog. This particular card is from October 17th, so it's not a first day of issue. In 1961, Pat Hearst's first full-length book was published, Nassau Street. And besides the stamp catalog, I would call this a must-have for any stamp collector. It recounts his 25 years of running a stamp business on Nassau Street. And it's got some great stories in it, let me tell you. One that still resonates today is where he recounts where in his early years, at closing time, at 5 o'clock, he went to one of his other dealer friends and said, "Hey, let's go over to the collector club. They're meeting tonight." And his friend said, "Oh, no, I don't want to go." He said, "Come on, man, don't you want to learn about stamps?" And he goes, "When it comes to stamps, they're just like potatoes. What do you need to know about potatoes to sell them?" And unfortunately, that's so true today, that anyone who's gotten a stamp album passed down from their father or grandfather thinks they can just sign up on eBay or HipStamp and they're a stamp dealer. And just looking at some of the listings, some of them can be quite cringeworthy. And then he followed that up with this book, Fun and Profit in Stamp Collecting. It's, as he points out in the book, it's not a how-to about how to make money with stamps. It just talks about how to be a proper stamp collector with your head screwed on right. And if you collect right, you will profit. Hearst went on to write several more books, stories to collect stamps by, more stories to collect stamps by, and even more stories to collect stamps by. And his last book, which was published posthumously because his son found it stashed away in a drawer, and it was published only a few years ago. It's called Put a Stamp on It. I'm not sure if there is a hard copy version of it. I have the Kindle version. And this book just has various stories about the intersection of stamps and historical events and how they played out together. In 1973, he finally called it quits in the stamp business altogether and retired to Florida. Although it was retirement only in the sense that he was no longer dealing in stamps. He still lectured on stamps, he spoke at stamp clubs, and even continued to write. Oh, and I read that he even started a third local post called the Boca Raton Bicycle Post, although I haven't seen any stamps for it or any covers. And this is the last item I have to show you of my Hearst memorabilia. June 1st, 1973 is the date of his retirement and the last day of issue for the Shrub Oak local dog post. And this cover was used to mail the final issue of Hearst's Outbursts, number 140, dated summer of 1973. And This is a great issue because after this initial article, he goes over in this article, how does one say goodbye? He just gives you a brief overview of his life and his career, and summarizes some of his favorite outbursts. Here he is in his first year on Nassau Street. I always have to take a double take because this dark spot behind his neck looks like a ponytail. So I say, that doesn't look like someone from 1936. And there is his home, which he called Olive Blossom in Shrub Oak. There is Sergeant Hearst in 1930 in the Vancouver Barracks, Washington. Here he is with a 14-foot sunflower he grew. And he took seeds from that sunflower and gave them to anyone who requested them, and had a contest to see who could grow the biggest sunflower from those seeds. Here's his first wife, Ingeborg Adam Hearst. Unfortunately, she had a premature death at the age of 38. He later married Mrs. Ida Bush of Mount Kisco, New York, who had literally joined the Hearst organization by the simple expedience of marrying the boss. And in 1968, he was inducted into the roll of Distinguished American Philatelists. He's shown here with the American Philatelic Society President, E.N. Willard. His final comment in this issue was a small piece on jumbo stamps. Jumbos are ones that have just extra wide margins on them. And he says that about 35 years ago, a collector walked into our office with the largest margined 2-cent Columbian we had ever seen. Today it would be called a jumbo. He asked whether we had to sell any of the rest of the set to match. It was his intention, he added, to build the entire set with similar jumbos. We often wonder how he made out. We are sure his goal was never reached. All the gold in the world probably couldn't accomplish that. 1.5 billion of the 2 cents were originally issued, and the percentage of jumbos is infinitesimal. How many jumbos could possibly exist of the $4 value, with only 26,000 issued? That would seem to be the reasoning behind some of the prices being paid today for jumbos, and we cannot help but wonder how much sense it makes to pay $400 or so for a stamp that ordinarily sells for less than $10, simply because it's a freak. The collector who pays 20 times catalog for a freak may feel that he's getting his money's worth. If the pleasure of possession brings him $400 worth of satisfaction, there's no one who should question his judgment. But when the time does come for that stamp to be sold, the fact that it is a freak and nothing more than a freak will hardly assure it's bringing the same price or anywhere near it. We regard the present vogue to overpay on curiosities of this sort as a temporary condition, a sort of harmless insanity which has engulfed a few collectors. We hope that those of our friends who read this will show their wisdom in collecting really fine material available from their dealer friends at fair prices, and not be carried away by what we feel is a rather temporary philatelic aberration. Unfortunately, that was not a prognostication or a prophecy or anything that came true for him, unlike most of his other sage words in the past. such as don't be foolish enough to be buying full sheets of every new issue that comes out. As in the past few years, grading has really become a thing, and jumbos especially just command the most ridiculously high prices. Pat Hearst passed away in 1999 at the age of 89. And the last thing I'd like to share with you is this inscription I found on the flyleaf of my version of Nassau Street. The inscription isn't by him, but from the previous owner. December 23rd, 1996, Monday, 3 p.m. I called the 800 number for Harman Herst Jr., which I found on the internet. Mr. Hearst picked up the phone himself. I asked him for this book and also how old he was. He told me he was 88 and had Alzheimer's and something else. And that something else was Parkinson's. And he was confined to a wheelchair. He still writes and works and is in good spirits. I spoke with a legend today.